And so as we're talking about some of the military side of things, I do want to put this up on your screen. This has been put out there by Fox News within the last hour or so, saying that the U.S. consulate in Dubai was hit by an Iranian drone. This was according to diplomatic sources. This has since been confirmed by Secretary of State Marco Rubio. And so to talk a lot more about what we're seeing there as far as military action goes, I do want to now bring into the conversation Stefano Ritondale. He's the Chief Intelligence Officer at Artorias. Stefano, thanks so much for being with us here on Live Now from Fox.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, let's start with the very basics. When it comes to this latest information and update that was confirmed by Fox News today, can you talk to us a little bit more about what we're seeing here? They spoke about an Iranian drone being the cause of this particular strike. What do we know about their military capabilities and their drone power there in Iran?
So, I mean, just to highlight how powerful the Iranian drone program is, I think for your viewers who might not know this, the Russians have been utilizing Iranian drones in their strike campaigns against Ukraine. The Russian calls it the Drone 2. In reality, it's just a Iranian drone called the Shahed 136. It's the same model, it's the same make, it's the same materials. And the Russians, realizing they had a significant strike gap and that their drone program was not as strong as they thought, reached out to the Iranians and they copied the Iranian Shahed 136. The irony of the situation is that the United States also, our Lucas drone program, which was our answer to provide a low cost effective measure because most of our drones are very high end and expensive. We basically copied the Shahed 136 as well to use it in our own system as a low cost strike platform, and more importantly, as a one-way attack drone or a suicide drone. So Iran has a very expansive drone program. The Shahed 136 is probably the most well-known, but there's dozens of drones they have. They have the Shahed 131, the Shahed 129, which is similar to our Predator drones, the Abel 2T, the Kaz-04. These are all smaller drones, one-way drones. So I just gave you a couple examples, but I think it clearly shows that they have a very robust drone program, and those drones play an integral part of conducting strikes, not only against the United States, but a lot of countries in the region as this war continues to heat up.
All right, Stefano, we are going to have to pause it here for just a second as we see right now stepping up to the microphone, Chuck Schumer, of course, the leader there on the Democratic side. Let's listen into his remarks.
You end up with an endless war. You end up with mission creep. You end up with all kinds of problems. And so the answers are not satisfying. And what's really needed is a public debate so the American people, who already are very much against this, can see what we have seen.
Would you support a supplemental funding request for this war?
Look, the bottom line is they haven't made the request yet. I'm not going to comment on it, but the bottom line is that before you can feel satisfied about a supplemental, and I haven't seen it, you have to know what the real goals are and what the end game is.
How much will it cost, you know?
No.
Mayor Schumer, do you think Israel, forced the U.S.'s hand here, boxed the U.S. in on this?
Look, no one wants a nuclear war. No one wants a nuclear Israel, but we certainly don't want an endless war, plain and simple. What did I say?
Nuclear Israel.
Oh, no, got it. Let me say that again. No one wants an endless war, but we certainly don't want a nuclear Iran. That's for sure. Okay?
At what point does the lack of DHS funding become a national security risk?
All right, and so we did want to hear that reaction there from Senator Chuck Schumer. Others are likely to step up to the microphone. We'll continue to bring you some of those prominent leaders as they begin to make those responses. And so we do want to head back into that conversation that we were having here with the CEO of Artorias, Central Intelligence Officer for Artorias, I should say, Stefano Ritondale. Let's head back to what we're talking about as far as identifying targets in the region. Is there some sort of method behind the places that Iran is choosing to strike during this and those retaliatory strikes that they are now mounting?
You know, what I would actually kind of highlight that the key aspect we did see during the beginning of the strikes that Iran did primarily focus on military bases. But it's important to note that a lot of those military bases that the U.S. has, for example, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, even in UAE, for the most part, were probably been evacuated based on reporting that we've got. They've been evacuated because the United States understood that those bases were going to be targeted. So they didn't really follow it. They weren't really of huge importance from the construct of conducting offensive operations and strikes instead of Iran. But Iran did do that as a retaliatory strike and clearly to try to send a message. But a lot of the aspects that we're seeing right now Iran do is also much more from a messaging and a symbolic strike in which they're targeting, for example, the U.S. consulate. As you saw, we saw yesterday the U.S. embassy in Saudi Arabia struck. We have seen other civilian targets in Dubai, for example, the airport. You know, a lot of targets that is trying to send a message that there's a cost for these countries, but not really primarily important from a military perspective and a military dimension to kind of to stop the United States or Israel from conducting strikes. Obviously, a lot of the ballistic missiles that Iran have launched has been directed against Israel, but the same mostly at civilian targets. Earlier this morning, we did see an increase on Iran really targeting Saudi, for example, and for example, Qatar's oil and natural gas infrastructure. Clearly, they're trying to raise the costs from an economic perspective, and exactly as the senators here alluded to, kind of the concern of gas prices going up. If that were to happen, they would target these oil refineries. So we have seen Iran do that. We'll see if this continues at this pace. But right now, they're really doing a lot of the symbolic and economic strikes, but not really degrading U.S. or Israel military capabilities to conduct operations inside of Iran.
That insight is very helpful as we're continuing to look over the skies. There, a shot in Tel Aviv at this hour, as really it's been these overnight hours when we've seen the majority of these strikes kind of aim at some of these areas within Israel from where we have vantage points with our cameras. So I also want to put this up on the screen as well, Stefano. I want to get your insight here. We do know that the U.S. Central Command put this out on their social media account saying this: the Iranian regime's killer drones have been a menace in the Middle East for years. These drones are no longer a tolerable risk. And so this is also referring to some of the mobile launchers that have been set to fire to inflict, as CENTCOM has said, maximum harm across the region. What are these mobile launchers? How can you sort of put it into layman's terms for folks here at home who might not be familiar with this tactic that's used?
Right. So just imagine yourself, you're driving on a highway and you see a 16 trailer, for example, consistent with a container in the back. And that container then opens up, and instead of products, it's just a drone that they can launch from there. That would be an example. We can see smaller pickup trucks that basically have a covering, and then you uncover it, and then there's one of these drones that they can launch. And that's the problem of these systems. That's why it's hard to find and track them, because a lot of times the way they look and are built and are designed mimic just normal civilian vehicles, and it's a harder thing to kind of track and destroy from a U.S. or Israeli military perspective. But that's what the Iranians are doing right now, and they've even do that with some of their other capabilities, such as their ballistic missiles. Now, the larger ballistic missiles, such as their medium-range ballistic missiles, the ones that reach, for example, Israel and Tel Aviv, that is very hard to distinguish and hide as they're very large. But the shorter range ballistic missiles, the ones that they would use to conduct strikes against, let's say, Dubai or Doha in Qatar, as they're smaller, some of them can somewhat times mimic what might appear to be civilian vehicles. And so that's the problem that a lot of the targeteers and the collection from the U.S. military perspective is finding them, because sometimes they do blend in with the civilian population and the vehicles they use, and they leverage that to really expand their strikes. And more importantly, a lot of these drones, they give it to their proxies in the regions. We know that the pro-Iranian groups in Iraq, they're suspected of conducting drone strikes already against Saudi Arabia and U.S. interest in Saudi Arabia, launching them from Iraq. They've received a lot of drones from Iran, and the strikes that we've seen in Erbil and Baghdad against U.S. military and diplomatic installations there have been done by these drones given to Iran by their proxies. Same with Hezbollah and the Houthis. So the problem is not only in Iran, but it's across the region with Iranian proxies using them.
And as you're mentioning Hezbollah, we have a live look there in Beirut where you can still see some of the smoke now there over the skyline. What we've been watching there is some of the retaliatory attacks that we've seen between Israel and Hezbollah now going on. In fact, earlier today on social media, I even saw a video of a plane taking off amidst some of the smoke over the city. So we'll continue to keep our eyes there. But Stefano, let's continue on. But some of the other actions that the IDF has now been making there in the region. I want to play out some of this video for folks at home who may not have seen this. So we do know that the IDF says that they targeted a nuclear weapons development site within Iran. What's the significance of this, and what kind of weaponry is typically used in a strike as we're seeing there on the screen?
So, based on the obviously the information that Israel has released, there's a lot of kind of missing information to really do an in-depth analysis. But it does look like this was somewhat of an underground facility based on the information they provided in the outskirts of Tehran. They probably wanted to build it there to kind of be easy access, try to build it underground. So more than likely, I would assume that the Israelis had to use bunker busting munitions. It does also indicate something I think is very important, is that Israel, for years now, we've kind of suspected and seen them action on it. But every time Iran tries to develop something related to the nuclear program, Israeli intelligence are able to quickly pinpoint and find it and even conduct strikes, either destroying their equipment or even assassinated key Iranian officials involved with the nuclear weapons program and their nuclear program. And this latest strike kind of came to a surprise to a lot of people because this wasn't a declared facility. And even the Israelis kind of highlighted that this was something that happened after Midnight Hammer. And it was an attempt to Iran to kind of restart their nuclear weapons program, because we do know some of their enrichment material was kind of, we weren't able to destroy all of it. And this could have been part of Iran's contingency plans to continue with the nuclear program. So the fact that Israel was able to strike it and destroy it does indicate a successful intelligence operation and also military operation to degrade Iran's nuclear program, which is one of the priorities of both Israel and the United States.
And it is so fascinating that we're seeing some of these images that are being put out, as well as sort of describing that area, also able to listen into the insight there from the IDF and other military sources as well. And so, Stefano, as we're kind of continuing this conversation, I want to talk about the importance of the U.S. Navy in all of this. Right now, we've been hearing from President Trump and other U.S. leaders that they have not confirmed anything to us or other media sources that there are any sort of boots on the ground, or even that that is a part of their operation that they are planning. So what portion of this does the U.S. Navy, do they play a role, as well as the airstrikes that we're seeing there in the region?
Right. So I think it's important to note that one of the key things that the Trump administration did as part of the buildup is they sent 2 carrier strike groups basically over to the region. And the carrier strike groups and the F-18s and the F-35s are kind of a contingent of that, play an integral part in a lot of the airstrikes that we're seeing inside of Iran. And that's a key projection power capability that the United States have to do these types of operation. But also, more importantly, a lot of the destroyers in both the Eastern Mediterranean, but more importantly in the Indian Ocean and off the Gulf of Oman, are providing cruise missile strikes and the Tomahawk cruise missile strikes against critical infrastructure inside of Iran as well. And so the Navy, in coordination with the Air Force, are leading the effort into conducting these strikes. Another area where the U.S. Navy would also play an important role is not only conducting strikes inside of Iran, but also some of them would likely be providing what we would call Aegis capabilities, in other words, anti-ballistic missile capabilities. So these destroyers are parked and placed near critical assets that need protection, and they assist in intercepting any Iranian ballistic missiles, specifically those that kind of enter through the atmosphere. So a lot of those mid-range ballistic missiles, the Aegis destroyers and their anti-ballistic missile capabilities are excellent to intercept those, and we're likely seeing them also be employed from that perspective, as well as an anti-air component, as you're showing right now, against those drones that are being launched. They can also be leveraged there. It's also important to note that President Trump today in his Truth Social announced that the United States Navy could be conducting basically, operations through the Straits of Hormuz to ensure it remains open. And that's a typical operation that the Navy is well versed in conducting. And that's also something that we might see them do very shortly in the near term as well.
And so we'll continue to watch some of this video as it is released from CENTCOM coming into our newsroom. And really seeing all this is fascinating to get an inside look as to how the operation is going right now in the Middle East. And so lastly here, Stefano, I want to ask you, let's talk about modern warfare and how things have changed so rapidly over the last few years. In fact, when you're thinking about it, there used to be boots on the ground, the Army, the Marines, that was the go-to way to conduct any sort of conflict. But now with the advancements in technology, what stands out to you that makes this operation different than even ones we've seen in the last 10 to 15 years?
What I would actually say the main difference that I would see compared to, let's say, 15 years ago, I think is actually more in the space and cyber capabilities. I think those are capabilities that really have advanced a lot, to the point where, in utilizing space-based operations and cyber-based operations, are able to have extreme effects against Iran and their military capability and their command and control without putting in danger, let's say, Air Force or Navy pilots, or expending resources such as a Tomahawk cruise missile, which is a very vital resource that the U.S. military has. And if you can have those same effects using non-kinetic means, using cyber means, then you're just going to do that, and you can even have a broader impact as well. It's important to note that Iran's internet connectivity is basically at 0%. We're getting minimum information out of Iran, and I think a lot of that also has to do with the success of both the U.S. and Israel's cyber capabilities of really disrupting command and control and operations there. And I think that's the main aspect and the main differentiation factor to an operation considered 15 years ago, where now instead of sending Air Force, or as you say, maybe ground troops to conduct specific operations to destroy capabilities, we could just rely on cyber and space-based operations that have already demonstrated their effectiveness in Maduro's operation in January and previous operations. Now in Iran, they're using it at a national level and a consistent level. And this is probably the first operation that the United States has conducted at this significant level and at this scale, utilizing cyber to really have an effect on the Iranians' military capabilities.
Stefano, so many different aspects that we wanted to touch on here. Running out of time on Live Now from Fox, but we certainly appreciate you, as always, for joining. Your insight is invaluable as we're working through all of the details as they come to us here on Live Now from Fox. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me.